In 1996, after they had taken control of most of Afghanistan, the Taliban began a wave of terror that repulsed people worldwide and gave insight into the type of world there might be if extreme Muslim fundamentalists had their way. The most infamous incidents were recorded and eventually broadcast in the West. They showed a scene from ancient times. Groups of women accused of various crimes in the view of the Taliban were led into the large soccer stadium in Kabul, covered from head to toe in their burqas, and were put into holes up to their necks. The holes were then filled in enough for the women not to be able to move, and they were then stoned to death. They knew their fate in advance and had a long time to think about what awaited them. Stoning itself is quicker than you might think, but it is still agonizingly long. People cheered, mostly because they were afraid not to. In August 2021, the Taliban surged into Kabul, taking the Afghan government and U.S. troops unaware. The government fell apart, and the Americans, who had already agreed to pull out of the country, hastily took thousands of Afghan civilians with them, all of whom were afraid they would be in the sights of the Taliban. And although they made nice public statements about how they would rule the country differently than last time and curb the excesses that had already put them in the Americans' crosshairs before Osama bin Laden used their country as a base for his campaign of terror against the USA, this year the Taliban had once again begun their public punishments and executions. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we look at the brutal reign of the Taliban. During the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, which lasted from 1979 to 1989, the United States sent weapons and advisors to the Mujahideen, an assorted group of Muslim guerrillas that included many Muslim fundamentalists, extreme fundamentalists. Some of these groups later formed the Taliban, with whom the United States would fight a war from 2001 to 2021, the longest war in American history, and lose. But at the time, the U.S. supported many anti-Soviet movements, so it should be no surprise that they armed the Afghan guerrillas to the teeth. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? The Soviets were propping up a communist puppet government with little popularity outside the capital. Afghanistan is a deeply religious country, and since the Soviet Union was officially an atheist country, not many people had a lot of enthusiasm for their government. However, it took about 10 years for it to be overthrown, and then a period of civil war for the Taliban to take over. The Taliban are Sunni Muslims, more specifically an offshoot of Sunni Islam called Deobandism, which calls for a strict interpretation of Islam and jihad, Muslim holy war against non-Muslims, and those Muslims they believe to be heretics. For example, the other major Islam sect, the Shia. Though the teachings of the Sunnah, the collected traditions and practices of the Prophet Muhammad, the Hadith, the Prophet's sayings, as well as the Muslim holy book, the Quran, as well as the Afghan and Muslim history, the Taliban put together their view of what life in Afghanistan should look like. For a Westerner and most other people in the world, Muslims included, that view was bleak. Total separation of the sexes, extreme prohibitions on the rights of women, including the right to an education, the complete banning of music, television, movies, and a criminal code so harsh that it reminded many people of accounts of the Dark Ages in Europe and the times of the Mongols in Asia. After the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan, an interim government of men from many different points of view attempted to construct a government acceptable to all Afghans. But Afghanistan was and is a patchwork of ethnic groups, traditions, and viewpoints, with many in the capital, Kabul, being relatively more liberal in outlook than the rest of the country. Two of the main groups that fought the Taliban, both before and after the Soviet invasion, were the Hazara ethnic group, a Shia minority, but which makes up a sizable portion of the population in the northern central part of the country, and the different militia groups that made up the Northern Alliance. In addition to being part of a different sect of Islam, most Taliban are members of the majority Pashtun ethnic group, who, in addition to being Muslim fundamentalists, have their own strict code of behavior and traditions, the Pashtunwali. Throughout Afghanistan's long history, fighting between ethnic groups has been the norm, not the exception. And during the civil war which followed the Soviets' departure, atrocities were committed by both sides, except that the Taliban has engaged not only in a religious war, but an ethnic war as well. And what you're about to hear is but one example of many incidents that occurred. Since it took over in 1996, the Taliban had been fighting the forces of the Northern Alliance. Many Northern Alliance fighters were Hazaras, and when the Taliban and their Arab allies from al-Qaeda swept into the area around the small city of Yakhaulang in the north of the country, they were looking for anyone that belonged to the Northern Alliance, perhaps new members of the Northern Alliance, and a large number of Hazara men and boys that had nothing whatsoever to do with the fighting. A UN report in October 2001 detailed what happened. Men, women, and children had their hands bound behind their backs and were led to prepared mass graves. Radio intercepts from the headquarters of Taliban leader Mullah Omar were also heard, providing instructions and logistical support for their men, making what happened quite obviously a premeditated act. 300 men, women, and children were shot and dumped into the prepared graves. Some of them had not even been questioned. They were Hazara, and that was enough. At least 15 smaller massacres happened throughout the region. In the town of Katakana, old men, women, and children sought shelter in the town's mosque in the hope that the Taliban would respect the holy place. They were wrong. 2 rockets were fired directly at the mosque, which collapsed. 73 had been inside when the rockets hit. Some of them were killed by the blasts, but most of those inside were trapped by the rubble or were underneath it wounded. The Taliban and their Arab fundamentalist allies refused to allow anyone to help those inside. Only 2 small children survived. Just 3 years before, the Taliban had temporarily overrun the regional capital of Mazar-e-Sharif. When they did, they went on a killing spree. No one knows exactly how many people were killed in Mazar, but estimates put the total at 10,000. This came after the local Taliban leader made a speech on loudspeakers set up all over the city, in which he proclaimed the Hazaras infidels and threatened to kill them all if they did not convert to Sunni Islam or leave the country. As this was happening, groups of Taliban marched through the streets, grabbing people at random or simply shooting them where they stood. Those who fled were shelled by artillery and rockets. To be fair, in 1998, the Taliban and the Hazara had committed atrocities against each other for years during the Soviet occupation and afterward. But what happened at Yakhaulang was pretty representative of how the Taliban treated anyone who opposed them. Under Taliban rule before the US invasion, women were invisible. When they ventured outside, they needed to be in the company of a male relative and covered by their burqas from head to toe. A cloth mesh covers the eyes to allow them to see. Women caught conversing with a man not related to her were subject to flogging and even execution. Many of those executions were carried out by stoning. Many others were shot in the back of the head publicly. Others were beheaded publicly. Women were forbidden a formal education beyond 3rd grade level, except for a few who received permission to be medical professionals of one type or another so they could treat other women. Any premarital sexual contact was strictly forbidden. Even an accusation could result in death. This meant that many jilted suitors leveled false accusations at the former object of their affection, which resulted in punishment or death. However, men who made false or too many accusations could also be punished. Anyone, male or female, owning a book not approved by the Taliban, which meant the Quran and a small number of other approved religious texts, were subject to whipping and perhaps execution, especially in the case of multiple offenses. When the leaders of the Taliban met with President Trump in 2019, they reportedly assured him, as they assured the rest of the world, that their harsh former practices would be toned down. But most people who knew them, including the hundreds of thousands who fled the country in August and September of 2021, knew they were lying, and recent events have borne this out. In just the first 6 months of 2023, numerous articles from news, human rights organizations, and governments worldwide have been published detailing the Taliban's return to its old methods. Just a few days ago, on June 8, 2023, Amnesty International released a report of human rights abuses and war crimes by the Taliban in the Panjshir Valley, long a hotbed of resistance against them. Men and boys have been randomly pulled off the street and disappeared. When the Taliban were asked by family members where their family members were, the reply was, "Your sons are in the mountains," meaning mass graves in the mountains. Video recorded by the local Taliban have found their way onto social media. In one, 9 people, all of whom have since been identified, were taken out to a hillside at about 6 a.m. and executed by rifle and machine gun fire. Their bodies rolled down the hillside and were left there. In May 2023, Al Jazeera, a news organization based in Muslim Qatar, published a critical article on the Taliban concerning the return of the same harsh punishments towards women they used before their overthrow in 2001. In addition to beatings, floggings, and the forced marriage of girls as young as 13 to much older men, disappearances and torture have been occurring increasingly. Many women tortured or disappeared were professional women who had not been able to leave the country, and those who protested in the streets for women's rights after the Taliban's return. Unfortunately, after 20 years of war, it seems unlikely that anyone outside Afghanistan will be willing to do anything to change things. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.